So kind of continuing in our focus on employability and preparing for the process, today we're going to talk more about the actual interview that you'll hopefully get to based on your wonderful resumes and cover letters, or your personal statement if we're talking about a grad school interview. So I know a lot of this is going to be very much review for a lot of you, but there are some best practice things that I'll mention in here that will hopefully still be useful for you. So if you don't already know, there's kind of 3 stages in the interview process: the pre-interview, the interview itself, and then the post. So what you do after you finish meeting with whoever it is. And so we're going to go through each of those stages today. So as part of the preparation or the pre-interview, you're going to be doing some research. So hopefully you'll have already done this when you're writing your resume and your cover letter, but if not, you want to go back, or sometimes you submit those documents and then it's months and months later before they tell you they actually want to bring you in for an interview. So you'll have to kind of refresh your research. So, as an example, if somebody's interviewing with Google, this is what they would want to be looking at. So you want to have at least an idea about the background of the organization, kind of understand what their goals are. Is it a company that's really about making profit, or is it a company that's trying to make some sort of change in the world? Do they have a new technology that they're really proud of? Do they have a technology that you've used maybe before in a different instance that you can kind of make a connection with? And so you also want to have an idea of how big it is, what kind of office space you're going to be working in. Is it a remote position where you're only going to interact with 2 people ever, or are you going to be in an office with kind of open cubicles where you're with 100 other people every day, just to kind of get an idea for the vibe, and then to see if that really meshes with what you'd want once you get into the interview stage. So you don't necessarily need to know all of these specifics, and you don't necessarily need to have firm answers, but you want to have an idea, just like a rough estimate of most of these sorts of questions you see on the screen now. And so some of the more technical stuff that you'd want to be prepared for is the platform they're using. So most of you are going to have at least a first round interview that's virtual now instead of actually going in person. You might still get a phone interview, but probably it's going to be on one of these like Zoom, Google Meets, or Google Hangouts, Teams, any of those sorts of things. So make sure that you've used that before. If you haven't, go play around with it before you actually connect for the interview. Make sure your internet connection is strong enough to have a good, strong connection with the sound and the video, and there's no lag. You want to make sure that what's behind you is appropriate. You don't want to have like your dog running around in the background, or your roommates coming out of the shower behind you. So use a virtual background if you can't get into a space where you just have like a blank wall. If you're in like a desk kind of situation, it's okay if there's stuff behind you. Actually my situation right now wouldn't be ideal because I'm backlit, so there's like a weird haze there and you can't really see me. So if I were in an interview, I would probably try to like rotate my desk around so I wouldn't have the sun behind me. So thinking about little things like that might impact you on the day. Always want to make sure that you have headphones that work, or that the sound from the computer is going to be strong enough, but you should always probably have headphones or earpods nearby just in case there is any kind of issue. Sometimes you get feedback that's more an issue of their connection than it is yours, so you want to have all of that ready if you need to troubleshoot in the moment. Then once you're in the interview, you're going to get some really basic questions. So pretty much it'll always start out with like, okay, tell me about yourself, introduce yourself to me. And so these 4 things are some of the things you might think about sharing. Probably not going to share all of them, because this is going to be, maybe a 3-4 minute answer. A lot of times at the beginning of the interview, they'll tell you, okay, we have 5 questions for you and we have 20 minutes to do them in. And so then you can kind of do the math to judge how long you should take for each answer. But some basic things, you want to talk about your education. So talk about your RBA or your BIS degree. What kinds of classes did you take? What was your focus? What was it that made you actually want to come to school? What were those kinds of key things for you? Then also think about your work experience. If you have work that's directly relevant, wonderful, talk about that. Maybe you can talk about how you kind of rose in responsibility in the role. If you don't have any directly relevant work experience, you can kind of give a summary, but then talk about the skills that you are using and how those are going to be transferable. And so that kind of slides into the key strengths. So this is like your first kind of almost like elevator pitch moment to be able to sell yourself to them. So whatever you answer in this question, you want it to be something that excites them and makes them think, oh yeah, it's good that we brought this person in for an interview because they're going to be perfect. So you just want to try to think about that. This is again going to be a situation where you're tailoring based on the job description. And so then in the future, you also want to make them feel loved, right? the way humans work, if you can kind of almost ingratiate yourself to them, it's going to set a good tone for the rest of the interview. So you want to be really positive, optimistic about the job that you're applying to. So this is where a lot of that research that you've done before will come into play. So hopefully you found something there about like their mission that really meshes with your goals or your values, and maybe you have like a volunteer experience that you can mention that ties in with that. And so that kind of situates you as somebody who's looking for the future, but somebody who's already kind of into that same like mind space as the rest of their employees, so they can see you easily slotting into the role there. So I want you to actually pause right now and take a minute to think about how you would answer that. So think about what education, what previous experiences, what key strengths, what future goals you would be able to have to talk about for the company or the grad school that you've been working on so far. How would you actually answer this? Think about timing too, like say it in your head almost and look on a clock to see how long you're taking to say it, just to kind of get into the practice of that. If you can get kind of a stable answer down to this tell me about yourself question, you're going to be able to set the tone for your interviews really well, because you have a strong answer there. You'll be comfortable with it, so it's not going to be something that like sets you off your game when you're just getting started. If you come in and they ask you a question and you don't know how to respond to it, you're going to feel off kilter probably for the whole rest of the interview. But if you come in with this kind of strong, almost rehearsed answer, it's going to make it a lot easier when you get to the next question that you're going to have no idea what it is and you're not going to have something prepared for. You're going to be settled and be able to think on your feet a little bit better. And so one way to do that is to get used to using this CAR technique. So some of you might have heard this before, or you might have heard of STAR. STAR is situation, task, action, and result. CAR is context, action, result, and relate. Either one works. They're really popular techniques just in all kind of careers, education fields. And so the context or the situation is, okay, what was happening? What was this situation? What was the event that I was working on? Give specifics, how many people were involved? What sort of physical location was it in? What sorts of maybe outside stresses were you feeling in the moment when you were working on it? Really build it up so they almost feel like they're in the moment with you. And then talk about the action. So what is it that you were actually doing? What were you tasked with doing? What sorts of responsibilities did you have? What skills were you demonstrating, and how were you demonstrating them? And then you would have a result. And so that's something that says, yes, I had this action I had to take, and then it was successful in this way. So this is something where if you think about the resume and the cover letter, I said quantifying things works really well. If you can quantify in the results, that's wonderful. So again, talk about how many people you impacted or how much money you made on the day, whatever it was. If there's something that you can really clearly say, okay, this was the tangible outcome from it, that's wonderful. And then relate is how you basically tie it back into this job now. So your experience, you could be giving an example of you playing on a team at university and you're applying for a job in sales. And so they don't look like they have a direct relation. It's your job to make them connect. So what is it about that experience on that team that you can bring into the sales position to really sell yourself? So things like communication skills, these things that we normally think of as transferable skills, that's what you're going to try to connect back to in the relate section of this. And so the interview in itself is a conversation, right? It should be a conversation at least. So you're going to feel like probably you're in you have a lower position because they're the ones who get to decide whether you get the job and the paycheck or not. But you want it to also be kind of building almost like a peer rapport situation. These are probably people that you're going to be working with regularly. And so you want to be able to kind of situate yourself as a potential peer. So don't feel like a student in the moment. Try to feel like I have valuable things to bring to this position, so I can speak with authority here. And in an interview, you're talking about yourself. So you should be able to speak with authority on yourself. You know yourself better than everybody else. So one of the things that you're going to do to start kind of building up that almost like sense of status in the interview is to start asking questions to them. And so this is important for you also, because this is how you really unpack whether this is a job that makes sense for you or not. So it could be the job would be perfect, but maybe the environment's really not good for you, and this is how you start to pull that out. There are a lot of stressful work environments, and so you need to try to figure out as much as you can if you're possibly entering into one before you enter into it. A lot of us don't necessarily always feel like we can be picky about jobs because we need the paycheck, but asking the right kinds of questions will give you at least some insight into it. And so even if you do have to take a job and you're getting maybe not great feelings from everybody, you know what you're going into, so it's good to be prepared in that way. So there's lots of example questions here. Good kind of standard across the board questions to ask, but you can also ask questions that are more specifics, like, I saw that your sales were lower last quarter. What's the plan for bringing that up to ensure that the company stays stable in the future? Things like that. It's still a reasonable thing to ask. So do think about that a little bit before you're in the interview situation. You don't want them to say, do you have any questions for us? And you say no, because that makes it seem like you're not actually committed to it at all. You don't have interest in the job because you haven't thought enough to care to ask them anything. So you want to have something ready to go. And so here there are some general questions that you could probably expect to be asked in an interview situation. So if we were in a real class, I would have you guys actually use these to interview each other. So maybe if you know somebody in the class, take some of these and practice with each other. Obviously, I can't make you do it in this format, but think about how you might answer some of these. So we have the general questions that are really just like background, is going to be the same across the board for probably almost any job, and then others that are behavior-based. And so these are going to connect more to what are the skills that they're actually looking for. So it's worth spending a few minutes to kind of read through these and see if you have an answer that you'd be able to give for this, or if you really are stumped by one, maybe that's one that you should sit and think about a little bit, just so you have thought about it. If it ever comes up in the future, you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that from that class I took, that I can answer it in this way. This makes sense. So just read through, get an idea. A lot of these probably you've already been asked, so a lot of this probably isn't new to you, but have a read through and see. And so here, summarizing everything for an interview, you're going to really use this as an opportunity to expand on your resume, expand on your cover letter. So I think I mentioned before, if you think about this all as a continuum, the resume is the first piece, and it's getting a little bit bigger in the cover letter, and then the interview is where it really gets to expand fully. So you go from just a list of facts and figures to a fully realized human being in the interview. So use that to your benefit. Think about when you're giving your answers to use that CAR or that STAR model to make sure it's a fully rounded response. Know your strengths and weaknesses. I've had students in the past, when you give the example question of what's a weakness, I've had some say, I have no weaknesses. That's not a great answer. You should have some kind of weakness. Nobody's perfect, but unfortunately, we don't live in a world with perfect people. So you want to try to frame it as something that you're acknowledging and something you're willing to work on. So if you're one of those who says, I have no weaknesses, think of a weakness and try to practice with it here. And so then you want to also be ready with your closing. So those are those questions you're going to ask the employer. One of the biggest issues that I see in documents and in interviews is people who say instead of tell, right? So you can say that you have any kinds of skills. A lot of you got this feedback on your resumes, actually. You say that you're flexible. Saying you're flexible means nothing. Telling me about an instance where you actually showed you were flexible, that tells me that you're flexible. Anybody can list all of these great skills on their resume. Anybody can identify, like, yeah, I'm a really organized person. It doesn't mean anything until you tell me how you've actually shown that you're organized. So just make sure that you're really going that next step to unpack everything. And then after the interview, this is an important piece a lot of people forget about. Send them some kind of acknowledgement. So like a thank you email, I appreciate that you spent that hour with me today. That was great. This also then gives you an opportunity to add in something. So if you maybe froze on a question and you didn't like the response you ended up giving, you could maybe do a little follow-up here, just a sentence or two to say, when you asked me about this, I feel like maybe my answer wasn't completely clear, so I'd like to clarify, and then give a little bit more information. Or maybe in the interview, they ask you about a project you worked on, and this is an opportunity that you could attach it to the email, and then they can actually look at the document. So doing this just kind of leaves them with like a good taste thinking about you as a prospective coworker. And all of you have access to the Career Services Center at WVU, so I really encourage you to reach out to them. I believe even as alum, you'll be able to come back and work with them for the rest of your lives, just as being part of the WVU community. So take advantage of that. They also have lots of careers fairs on campus, and they do have some virtual ones as well. So please talk to them if you haven't already. They're really useful people. The website, even in itself, if you don't make any human connections, there's a lot of really good materials on the website. So I would say at least go check that out. So that's interviewing. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm sure a lot of it was a review, but hopefully there's some new things for you to think about as well.